Today, we're going to dive into one of the most powerful stories in all of Western literature, and it's pulled right from Goethe's Faust. It's this incredible first-person parable of absolute tragedy that somehow turns into this stunning tale of divine transformation. It all centers on a character named Gretchen, and her journey asks a really fundamental question about what salvation even means.
So, yeah, that's the big question, right? How does a story of total, complete ruin become a story of ultimate redemption? We're going to follow a narrative that goes to the absolute darkest places you can imagine, only to find this incredibly profound and unexpected light. So let's jump right in at the beginning of her story. Our story kicks off in a place of just complete simplicity and peace. This is part one, A Garden of Innocence. This is where we meet our narrator, Gretchen, and really get a feel for the world she lived in before everything, and I mean everything, changed. Now, what's so fascinating about how she opens her story is how she defines herself. She wasn't just in a small world. She says she was the small world. Her whole being, her entire existence was this quiet, ordered garden. Life was all about predictable rhythms and simple faith. It's just this perfectly contained image of innocence. So what did that small world actually look like? Well, it was built on what the source calls a simple purity and naivete. Hers was a life of humble devotion, completely wrapped up inside the safe, predictable borders of her village. But here's the crucial part. It's not just that her world was small. It's that she was totally content with it. She lived by the laws of God and men, and she wasn't looking for anything more. And that makes the collision with a character who wants everything all the more devastating. And this just lays it out perfectly, the conflict that's about to ignite. You've got her world of purity on one side, and on the other, the world of the scholar, Faust, which is driven by an insatiable desire. Her humble devotion, it's a million miles away from his obsession with dusty books. And while she follows the laws of God and men, he's just fueled by this seething fire of youth. These aren't just two people meeting, these are two completely opposing forces about to smash into each other. So let's move on to part two and see what happens when those worlds collide. As you can probably guess from the title, that quiet garden of innocence is about to get completely swallowed up by a storm of ruin. And this is how the storm begins. She falls in love. But listen to how she puts it. She was blinded by the very thing Faust was searching for, an intense, visceral experience. Think about that. She wasn't just a person he fell for. She became the object of his quest, the very experience he was desperately chasing. So here's the absolute heart of the tragedy. His striving, his relentless quest for knowledge and feeling was like a hurricane that, as the source says, knew no empathy. And she was just caught right in the middle of it. She became the collateral damage of his totally self-centered search for the absolute. He would move on, but she'd be the one left buried in the wreckage. And man, her world just fell apart so fast. It was this brutal, unstoppable chain reaction. First, the private act. She becomes unmarried and pregnant. Of course, that leads to a huge public scandal, drawing what she calls the poisonous flies of village gossip. Then, that shame explodes into a family tragedy when her brother, Valentine, is killed defending an honor she's already lost. And the final step? She's left utterly, totally crushed by society. In just a handful of tragic events, her small world isn't just damaged, it is gone, completely destroyed. And this brings us to the absolute lowest point of the story, part three, the Dungeon of Judgment. Here, after losing everything, she has to face one final, terrible choice. Alone, overwhelmed by all the shame and cruelty, her mind just breaks. Madness takes over. And it leads to an act that is almost impossible to comprehend. She takes the life of her own child. This is what seals her fate in the eyes of the world. This is what leads her to the executioner's block. But then, just when all seems lost, there's a flicker of hope. Faust comes back, right there in her dungeon. But look who he's with, his devilish companion, Mephistopheles, and he's holding the keys. They offer her a way out, a chance to escape execution. It seems like the one thing anyone in her position would want. But in this moment of total darkness, she has this flash of perfect clarity. She sees right through the immediate promise of freedom. She sees the monster lurking just behind it. She sees the damnation that comes with their kind of help. And she realizes their escape isn't salvation at all. So this puts you right in her shoes. The choice is stark. You can accept certain death by the executioner's hand, or you can run. but in doing so, join Faust and his devilish friend in their own damnation. Seriously, what would you choose? Her choice is just astonishing. She refuses. She turns down the escape. Instead, she accepts her earthly punishment. She literally bows her head to the judgment of the law. This single act of refusal, this is the pivot on which the entire story, the entire parable, turns. And that completely counterintuitive choice, well, it leads us to our final transformative act. Part 4, the ascent of the eternal. We're about to go from the dungeon all the way to the divine. And here it is, the great paradox of the whole story. Her refusal to run away was her salvation. By accepting her guilt, by accepting her earthly punishment, she was seen as worthy of redemption. She was lifted up, not by some dark magic from Faust, but by God's grace. And she doesn't just, go to heaven. She is transformed into a concept, an ideal. She becomes what's known as the eternal feminine. And what is that? Well, it's a divine force of grace and redemption. In Goethe's philosophy, it's this idea of a pure, selfless love that has the power to guide striving, flawed souls, like Faust, upward, toward the light and toward salvation. And this is where the story comes completely full circle. Faust goes on, lives this long, striving life, but at the very end of his road, whose soul appears in the higher spheres to guide him? It's Gretchen's, now transformed. The very person he destroyed is the one who ultimately saves him. This quote just captures the beautiful, stunning irony at the heart of it all. The victim became the vessel of redemption, and that small world that Faust so carelessly shattered on his quest for greatness, in the end, it became the very divine force that pulled his soul into the light. It's just incredible. Which leaves us with this final, powerful question to think about. This whole parable seems to suggest that maybe salvation isn't found by running away from our mistakes or our pain. So, is it possible that true grace can only be found not by escaping our suffering, but by turning to face it and fully embracing it? That's a profound thought to end on. Thanks for joining me for this explainer on the parable of the eternal feminine.